Thank you very much, everyone. And I hope you enjoy your tea and coffee there this morning. Actually, in this session, we also have some time where we'd like you to talk and share your experiences around the tables. So I hope that when we ask you, it won't be silent. We very much encourage your input because, as I said, we want to bring in your ideas and share them more widely, because I know from the conversations I was listening to, we have a lot of very good experience here around the room today. If you have a look at your agenda, you'll see that in this session we have this focus on energy efficiency and SMEs. I will provide a broad overview and international perspective. We then have Mr. Prasanto Pal, who'll be giving us the Asian perspective, bringing us into a focus on India. We have an apology from Mr. Samir Pandita, who couldn't make it today. He is from the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, but I think we've heard some of the important directions that they are taking from Mr. Sharma this morning. We have Gaurav Sharma about providing us with a case study in the foundry and steel rolling mills, SMEs in India. Mr. Upinder Dhingra will be talking about that crucial financing side of things. And the way we'll do this is we can take a couple of quick questions of clarification after the presentations, but we want to make some time after all the presentations. If you have any questions, please write them down as you go, and then at the end of the session we can bring up each of the speakers and you can ask your questions. So as was introduced this morning, my background, I've been working with the International Energy Agency on a guide for energy efficiency policy in small and medium enterprises. And you've also heard this morning this can be quite challenging. Governments around the world have tended to focus on the larger organisations. They're a bit easier to work with, they're a bit easier to identify. Often they have some resources where they can put in place an energy manager and so on. But we know that SMEs are important, certainly in India, but also very much around the world. So I'd like to talk about our research and the experience, the lessons learnt from development of this publication for the International Energy Agency. And I want to explore 4 key questions. Why is energy efficiency improvement in SMEs important? Why are government and industry-led programs necessary? What's currently happening that we can learn from? And how can we develop and improve what's happening in India and around the world? So the first question, why is energy efficiency important? I think that's pretty clear to everyone in this room. If we take a step back and we look at it from 2 perspectives. Firstly, from an energy perspective, there's some statistics that highlight industry consumes around 1/3 of global energy, and there's potential energy savings of 26 exajoules, a large number. That's the equivalent to the current annual energy consumption of the United States and China combined. When we look at this globally, we see potential from cost-effective energy efficiency projects in the industrial sector. Now then, if we break it down to the SME sector, we say, well, we can't ignore the SME sector because roughly they account for 30% of total industrial energy consumption. So right there's an imperative from an energy perspective. But with SMEs, we've also heard today, they're the engine of economic growth and development around the world, in my country, Australia, and here in India, and right around the world, because it's through small and medium enterprises, many of the people here in this room, drives innovation. They have the flexibility to pick up and move into new things, driving employment, very large number of employment here employ many people here in India and around the world, and ultimately contribute to economic growth. So we're not just talking about a focus on energy here. We're talking about a focus on the economy more broadly, and there are spin-off environmental benefits as well. And when we think about energy efficiency for SMEs, it's really important, we find, to have this broader perspective beyond just the energy saving. And the International Energy Agency has been doing some work on the multiple benefits of energy efficiency. And when we look at industrial SMEs, that becomes quite clear because we have this virtuous cycle of benefits. If we can accelerate energy efficiency in SMEs, that helps those SMEs, reducing costs, increasing productivity, product quality, a whole lot of benefits, ultimately flowing through to competitiveness, growth and employment. That then feeds into the broader economy, reducing energy demand and the needs and costs around energy infrastructure, reducing local air pollution, but also greenhouse gas emissions, contributing to economic growth and employment. So this is a virtual cycle. So why should we focus on SMEs? Because it's good for SMEs and it's good for the wider economy. So why are programs necessary? Why should governments and industry associations, or even why should individual SMEs start to look more closely at energy efficiency? We've already also heard this morning, there are barriers that stop energy efficiency from happening. Even the most cost-effective projects that improve product quality and deliver a whole host of benefits, it's even harder to make these happen in many SMEs. Why? Because there are information barriers. If a manager doesn't know what the opportunity is, if they don't have the numbers, the financials, as well as the engineering information, how can they make a decision and implement a very good project? It's unknown. There are skill barriers. Having the skill to identify that opportunity, to put the financial case together, to access the finance, for example, there are many different skill barriers at play. And resources. Where do you find the time as well when you're very focused on your core business? And there's finance barriers. If you go to the bank with your energy efficiency project and they're not familiar with financing that type of project, then they may not lend you the money. It can be very difficult. And also in SMEs, perhaps the collateral, the backing for the loan may be less strong than it is for larger projects in larger organisations. So for these reasons, there's a very good argument for governments and industry associations, for financiers to really get involved in energy efficiency. So what is currently happening? In developing our policy pathway, this guide to energy efficiency policy in SMEs, we looked around the world and we looked at about 30 case studies or so. We looked to India, and there will be a case study of India. I won't talk about that because we have some excellent presenters after my presentation talking about what's happening here. In Turkey, at the national level, in Europe through the industry associations, in Australia through the local and regional governments, in China, all around the world there are some good SME programs. Let me just draw out a couple to provide some examples. The first one I'd like to talk about is the Australian Energy Efficiency Information Grants Program. This one started in 2012, and as the name suggests, it's a response to the information challenge. So we have, like other countries, SMEs are dispersed in many different industry sectors. It's hard to really get a handle on them. So the approach that was taken in this program was to provide grants, funding to deliver practical, tailored energy efficiency information to SMEs. But rather than adopting a top-down central government approach, before the grants in the funding applications, the government encouraged partnerships between industry associations, technical experts, energy consultants and educational institutions. And this was one way of actually getting the stakeholders on the ground who know these industries and companies really well to really target their information. And a whole range of industry sectors were addressed, including food processing, wineries and foundries. Just to provide a couple of examples. Take my favourite, because I do like wine. In the South Australian state, we have many wineries. And when you walk into a winery, they're often beautiful. You can taste some wine, have a nice time. And at the back, the industry is really going on. Tanks, heating, cooling, pumping, lots of energy being used so that we can enjoy our wine. In one of these examples, it was the combination of the energy consultant and the industry associations of actually working with the companies to walk out the back to look at their business with an energy efficiency lens. And they found some significant improvements. Why hadn't that business owner, that SME, picked up on those opportunities? Because they were busy making wine. Because they relied on the equipment suppliers who had already supplied them with their tanks and other things. So they didn't have the information, they didn't have the knowledge. As a result of the program, they were able to reduce their energy use by 23% by insulating a number of their processing tanks. It's just one simple illustration, and I'm sure you have many from here in India, where there are projects that can be really beneficial to these SMEs, but without the information, without the time and effort to actually look at them and find out about them, they're just not going to happen. So this is an example of how governments and industry associations and others can get involved to progress projects. The second program that I'd like to just briefly mention is one that's been developed by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and this one was first established in 2004. It's now operating in a large number of countries, and what I find very interesting about this is that it's certainly starting from a finance perspective. It's a bank, it's a development bank, but it's not just leaving it at the financing problem. It's addressing multiple issues. And so the program, Sustainable Energy Financing Facilities, one aspect is to provide dedicated credit lines for energy efficiency to local banks, for example in Turkey, in the Ukraine and so on. So they're dealing with the financing issue by providing those funds to the local banks. The local banks have their networks. They're also providing training and support to the local banks so that they understand energy efficiency projects, what they can do, how they can process the loans, how they can minimise the financial risks and so on. So it motivates the banks by showing that energy efficiency is profitable and that there's a benefit for the banks. They can build client relationships and meet their regulatory requirements around social and environmental aspects. For the SMEs, they don't just stop at the bank. For the SMEs, they support the technical support to identify the measures, to deal with these information issues. So they're making sure that this is also happening at the SME level so that when the applications for finance come through on the energy efficiency projects, they're good applications, makes it easier for the banks to fund them. They also work at the policy level in different areas. For example, in Russia, they're working with the Russian government to help them develop a scheme for labelling of motors, high efficiency motors. And so in this way, they're also influencing that enabling framework. So the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development example of sustainable energy financing facilities gives us an idea, some clues about what aspects of programs can be really successful and the importance of addressing each of those different stakeholders by supporting them and dealing with the different barriers. So just moving off those examples, I wanted to just talk about when we looked across 30 case studies and what's happening here in India and Russia and China and Europe as well, we thought, what does this tell us? At the sort of broader level, what does it tell us about successful programs? And we came up with 6 strategies for success. Now, whilst these strategies are more targeted perhaps at policymakers and program developers in financial institutions or in industry associations, I think they're also applicable for SMEs themselves. There's some sensible strategies that can really help progress energy efficiency. The first one is about understanding the needs of the SME target group. And I think India is an excellent example here through your cluster programs, and it's great to have representatives from the clusters here today because SMEs are diverse. Different activities and different related energy consumption, different market drivers, geographic locations, supply issues. So it's important to understand each group on the ground because of these different variables, and to carefully assess the particular barriers and needs that they have. Because it's only by understanding SMEs, or if you're a manager in an SME, understanding your own organisation, that you can then do the intervention that's going to be most successful. So this is a very important part of progressing energy efficiency. This is my favourite because I have long worked with energy efficiency service providers in Australia and other countries where they're very passionate about energy savings. And I'm passionate about that too. But sometimes the focus on energy savings forgets that what a business manager in SME or any organisation wants to know is what's good for my business. Beyond, energy savings is good, what else? Because you're focused on products, customers, some really big important issues that affect profitability. So this second strategy is to make sure there's a focus on multiple benefits, not just energy savings. And one example is a glassware company. This was involved in IKEA, a large multinational, have a supply chain energy efficiency program. So they went into the factory in China and worked with the factory. And yes, they saved a significant amounts of energy and greenhouse gas emissions, but for the business owners, what was particularly exciting for them was that the output of one product increased from 900 to 1,050 pieces, so getting greater output and greater quality from 75 to 80%. Really important. In another product, again, 1,200 to 1,350, and reduced the product cost by 12.5%. So they were talking the business owner's language, and this was very important. Ultimately, the initiative did lead to 35% in greenhouse gas reductions between 2009 and 2010. So that was the second strategy, really focusing on the multiple benefits. The third strategy is around building stakeholder partnerships. And I suppose with larger organisations, when we look at energy efficiency programs around the world, stakeholder partnerships are important, but somehow the larger organisations have the resources to manage. In order to deal with the many and dispersed SMEs, it's important to tap into the range of stakeholders that have the local networks. Governments at different levels, working with financial institutions, industry associations, equipment suppliers, utilities, consultants, educational institutions, NGOs. So early in developing a program or in reviewing a program, taking a step back and looking at who the different stakeholders are can really make a difference. Building those partnerships can enhance and help scale up SME energy efficiency programs. The fourth strategy relates to the design of measures for the program. And we've heard about the barriers to energy efficiency. We talk about three broad categories of barriers, but there's multiple barriers. It's a real challenge. So an integrated approach is essential. Again, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development example is a good way of showing how they're dealing with information, capacity building, finance, and also influencing cross-cutting and enabling policies. So combining these measures is very important. Leveraging existing policies and programs. SME programs don't happen in isolation, so often, whether it's labelling schemes or the building up and developing the energy services sector, these things can all be leveraged to actually support SMEs as well. And the final strategy that we found when we looked across all of these cases was that it has to be easy for SMEs to access assistance. And this is all a challenge for everyone. In designing programs, you need to have eligibility criteria, you need to have ways of showing that the right people are justified in accessing the resources. But at the same time, it needs to be balanced between, if there's too many barriers to actually get assistance, then assistance won't actually happen. And certainly we see that very much in our Australian programs as well. So I'll finish with the 6 strategies there, and hopefully that's been useful for you, and I welcome some questions at the end of the session. Before we move into the next session, I just wanted to ask you just to have a brief discussion around your table before we hear from the Indian examples of what's happening in this area. And there's 2 questions on the... There are 2 questions here that we want to explore. The first one, we want to understand what challenges you face. And the second one, what sorts of things are going to actually help you, especially from the industry people, but also from the policies. So if I could just ask you with the first one, just to take a couple of minutes now around your tables to discuss from your perspective, what are the main challenges? And at your tables, you'll see that there are some post-it notes. I'll show you. We just put some paper on your table with the title of challenges, and we put some of these post-it notes here. I would ask you now or throughout the session, if you want to add to this, please write down one of the challenges that you face, and then you can add it to this piece of paper. That would be really useful. So have a discussion for a couple of minutes, write down some of your challenges and share them with us, and then we'll move on, but at the end of the session we'll have more of a discussion around these things. Okay? So take 2 minutes now, and then we'll move on with our speakers.